How's it, team? Welcome back to another episode of the Sin Bin. As discussed last week, or the week before, I'm going to start playing with a wee bit of wood. And as mentioned, Mark Dana from Dana Made, he's gone and, he started a bit of a competition with regards to people making stuff out of pallet wood. Which got me thinking. You see, this bloke, he's gone and made furniture into pallets, which in itself is a bit strange. But the bloke's Aussie, so we let that fly. And so I thought to myself, pallets coming from trees, let's make a tree. A crap table, like the one that I've got here, is going to serve its purpose just nicely. I mean, essentially, all you're using it for is to chop wood. It's not really a tree, right? Right from the outset, let me just clarify that. What I'm making is a bird table. Living in Wales, there are an awful lot of birds flying around. We get all sorts of birds, birds of prey. They're stunning. Some of them are massive. And so I thought, what's a good way to get birds in the garden? The garden during the winter season, it often, you'll see. So what I figured was, instead of trying to make a tree out of uprights, I'd cut loads of squares and eventually carve them into a tree. Now, this process in itself is not one for the faint-hearted. It took me ages. Just cutting the timber into squares for a start. I mean, I ended up cutting up about 7 lengths, which isn't too bad. But then comes the gluing process. And the gluing process absolutely does my head in. Not because I don't like it, but because it's just so time consuming. I mean, you can see here, you do one piece, and that equates to a roughly, 20 millimeters? And I wanted this thing to be at least 1200 high, so, yeah, you do the math. Being a rugby channel, I figured I'm going to try and keep the rugby thing going, but we'll get to that. One of the important elements, though, of doing a glue up is making sure that you cover the entire surface. You want it to bond as much as possible. So what I also did was I used coach bolts with these massive long bolts, but it didn't show me screwing those in, largely because of, time. What I tend to do is make about 6 inches, or about 150 centimeters, and then glue it to the next one, and then chuck a ramrod screw right through the middle of that lot, and so on and so forth. I'd use different sized timbers. Some of them are 140 mil wide, some of them 120, some of them 90. They're not all the same size, but that's what you want, because with a tree, it gets skinnier as you get higher. I'm not a botanist or anything, it's just conventional wisdom tells me that. Now, once all the gluing has been done, what I'd do is I'd clamp it together and leave it to sit overnight. So I'd finally glued and screwed everything, took it outside, and started the carving process. Now, the bit I've used, it's called a cut saw bit. You can use it in an angle grinder. It's perfect for cutting wood. The problem with using something like that, however, is the amount of dust that you produce. It is a huge amount of dust. If you were to look outside the shed right now, yeah, it's dust central. Fortunately, I've got neighbours that are quite understanding. On one side, I've got a little old lady, Tina. She's cool. She's a pot of gold, to be perfectly honest. And on the other side of the house, I've got a police officer who, he works shifts. And unbeknownst to me, when I went outside to start carving this thing, he was on the night shift, and I didn't know it. Paul, I apologise. He's a good sort though. As soon as he found out what I was up to, he was like, go for it. So, here we are, me, going for it. So this element here takes a wee bit of creativity, not least of which because, well, you need to make squares round. As well as that, you need to try and make it round all the way up, whilst maintaining the look of a tree. Does that make sense? Anyway. Now for the tree top, what I wanted to do was create the shape of a rugby ball. The best way to go about this, in my mind's eye, was to cut up a couple of lengths of pallet wood, glue them together, and then make the shape. Now the glue up itself, I was just using random pallet wood, so there's nothing uniform about these three pieces of wood here. As you can see, it was a bit of an issue, but we got there. And once it was all dried, I looked at the flattest side, which wasn't terribly flat at all. There was a lot of sanding involved. In fact, there was so much sanding involved, I decided not to film too much of that element because you'll see that there's ridges on the two end side, to the two end boards. And because of what I wanted to do with the tabletop, I ended up having to sand them down flush. That in itself was an issue. I basically spent a day in here sanding. It's one of my least favorite aspects, and is at the same time one of my favorite aspects of doing anything to do with wood. Least favorite because of the time, but once it's done and it's done properly, it'll look fantastic. And as you'll see, well, as I hope you'll see, it doesn't end up looking too bad. So what I've got here in the shed is I've got a 1 meter ruler, and all I did was use a few nails to create the shape of the rugby ball. The shape wasn't quite perfect, so I had to come along afterwards with a pencil and do some reshaping, if you like. Once I was happy enough with the shape, flash out the old jigsaw and do some cutting. Now I need to tell you, as far as the tools are that I used, I borrowed some of them and I've got a few. The drop saw I got when I started building the shed out of pallets, that was a huge time saver. But I also borrowed a jigsaw off a mate of mine, 𝐥𝐤. Not Scottish or anything. In fact, he's about as southwest as you could possibly get. Awesome chap. Let me use it. It was all good. Then came the arty part. Now, I didn't film me drawing up the 𝐥𝐤𝐤. I figured that was going to be something that's going to take a huge amount of time. And it did, only because I wanted to try and get it right. What I did film was the soldering iron process. Now, I don't even know if it is a soldering iron that I've got here, but it's awesome for burning into wood. There are things to remember though when you're burning into wood, and that is, make sure that it's hot. Hot. Hotter than the hottest you could possibly imagine. Nah, that's all a stretch. It wants to be really, really hot. The beauty is as well though, if you're using a spike, kind of burns itself into the wood, so following lines isn't too much of an issue. The only problem is you need to go slowly. So once I did that, I coloured in. You won't see me colouring in the 𝐥𝐤𝐤 because it's a lot of the same as what I did with the logo there. Now, making the tabletop a rugby ball wasn't my first thought, but then it's a rugby channel. And I thought I may as well try and keep things rugby. So I did. Now, with the ball complete, I thought I'd go back and do a wee bit more sanding on the tree itself. And as you can see, I made not a stump, but I made it look as though I chopped off a branch, like a normal tree. And what I'm going to use that branch for is for like dangling those, squirrel feeders or bird feeders, things you put nuts in. I also wanted to make sure that I'd be able to attach the tabletop to the base whilst looking still semi-tree-ish. Tree-ish? Is that a word? It is now. So I thought I'd get out the old Dremel and start shaving the top to make it look slightly more rounder. But that ended up being a job that was going to take far too long. And because of the way the weather was the other day, I couldn't really carve outside and film at the same time, but I did want to film it. So I put a mask on and I carved up in here in the shade. Now, it's not something that I'd advise because of the mess. I did this about 3 days ago, and it's basically taken all of that time to get the shed cleaned up. Dust gets everywhere. It gets everywhere. Not advised. Once I finally got the shape right, what I needed to do was find a big enough piece of wood that I could kind of round off as well. Stick it on the top there and trace around the bottom of it so that I'd at least have the same shape to work with. Once I'd traced out the top of the tree stump, I'd then attach that to the bottom of the tabletop, and then we'd start carving again. By the time we got to this stage, it had already taken me a few days, so I wanted to glue it down relatively quickly. Wood glue's perfect. It is, it's brilliant. But instead of covering the whole lot, what I wanted to also do was use a wee bit of super glue, just to make sure that it stuck while it was still going off. And that way, I'd be able to come along with the carver again and start playing some more. Now, it's all remarkably sped up. I mean, even carving this base part for the tree, it took me about 15-20 minutes. But obviously for you guys, it's going to take a whole lot shorter. Now, once I was there or thereabouts, came glue up time. Now, like all good woodworkers, what I did was I absolutely forgot which way I'd orientated these pieces of wood. However, being the genius that I am, I absolutely fluked it first time, which is just as well, because they're super glue, it's super glue all right. And here goes the table. I'm gonna have to go and chuck some bread on it, stick it out in the garden, and see what's what. Well, that was an exercise in futility. Well, let me know in the comments down below. there's a whole lot of stuff that I didn't bother filming because I thought it might be boring. So just let me know what you think. As well with the voiceovers and what have you. It's all a learning curve as far as I'm concerned. Anyway, next week we're going to be doing some more art. I've got a female version of the male Avengers version on the go. Excuse me, it's a bit bright. But yeah, we'll do that.